For years, one of the biggest reasons people refused to leave Windows behind had nothing to do with gaming, design, or even familiarity. It was always the same argument repeated again and again across forums, offices, classrooms, and tech videos. I would switch to Linux, but my apps don't work. That single sentence protected Microsoft for decades. No matter how fast Linux became, no matter how secure it was, no matter how customizable or lightweight it felt, millions of users stayed trapped inside the Windows ecosystem because of software compatibility. And honestly, that fear made sense. People depend on certain applications for work, school, business, editing, engineering, finance, and creativity. Telling users to abandon everything they rely on just to try another operating system was never realistic. But now, in 2026, something unexpected has happened. A new platform called WinPodX has entered the Linux world, and according to many users, developers, and even longtime Windows fans, it may have just changed everything forever. At first glance, WinPodX sounds almost too ambitious to be real. The promise is simple but massive. Run Windows applications on Linux seamlessly, with almost no setup, almost no tweaking, and almost no technical headaches. That sounds familiar because Linux users have heard promises like this before. For years, tools like Wine, Proton, Bottles, Lutris, and virtual machines tried to bridge the gap between Windows and Linux compatibility. Some worked surprisingly well. Others required hours of troubleshooting. Sometimes apps launched perfectly one day and broke completely after an update the next day. Many users simply gave up and returned to Windows because the process felt exhausting. Linux enthusiasts often underestimated how important convenience actually is. Most normal users do not want tutorials, terminal commands, dependency fixes, DLL overrides, registry edits, or compatibility patches. They want to click install and start working. That is it. This is where WinPodX shocked the Linux community. Instead of behaving like another experimental compatibility layer designed mainly for advanced users, it approached the problem differently. The developers behind the project focused obsessively on user experience. They understood something the Linux ecosystem had ignored for too long. Most people are not operating system enthusiasts. They are regular users who simply need their applications to work. So rather than forcing users to adapt to Linux, WinPodX adapts Linux to the user. The first time many people saw WinPodX in action, they genuinely thought it was fake. Videos started appearing online showing popular Windows software launching on Linux desktops with almost native performance. Office applications opened instantly. Professional editing software ran smoothly. Older Windows-only programs from the early 2000s suddenly worked again. Games launched without endless tweaks. Some users even demonstrated complex enterprise software operating on Linux systems that had never officially supported anything outside Windows. The reactions online were explosive. Windows users were confused. Linux users were excited. Tech forums were flooded with debates. Was this finally the moment Linux broke free from software compatibility limitations? What makes WinPodX different is not just compatibility. It is the way the experience feels invisible. Earlier compatibility tools often reminded you constantly that you were running a workaround. Menus looked broken. Fonts rendered strangely. File dialogues behaved inconsistently. Performance dipped randomly. But WinPodX focuses heavily on integration. Windows apps feel like native Linux applications. They appear directly inside the Linux app launcher. File associations work correctly. Notifications integrate properly with the desktop environment. Clipboard sharing feels seamless. GPU acceleration functions far better than many expected. Even drag-and-drop support between Linux and Windows apps works surprisingly well in many cases. This created a strange new reality in 2026. For the first time ever, users started asking a question nobody expected to hear on a large scale. If Linux can now run Windows applications this easily, why stay on Windows at all? That question terrified many people inside the traditional Windows ecosystem because the answer is uncomfortable. Windows has increasingly frustrated users over the last several years. Forced AI integrations, aggressive telemetry, mandatory online accounts, background services, advertising inside the operating system, subscription pushes, bloated updates, and hardware restrictions slowly pushed users toward alternatives. Linux distributions meanwhile became cleaner, faster, and more polished every year. Distros like Linux Mint, Ubuntu, Fedora Linux, and KDE Neon matured dramatically. The only major thing holding back mainstream migration was application support. WinPodX attacked that weakness directly. What surprised people even more was the performance. Normally, running applications through compatibility layers introduces overhead. Users expected slower speeds, glitches, or instability. Instead, many benchmarks showed certain applications running nearly as fast as native Windows installations. Some lightweight systems even performed better because Linux itself consumed fewer resources in the background compared to modern Windows builds. Older laptops suddenly felt usable again. Users revived aging hardware instead of throwing it away. This became especially important in regions where expensive hardware upgrades are unrealistic for many people. The rise of WinPodX also exposed how much software lock-in controlled the computer industry for decades. Many companies never built Linux versions of their applications because they assumed users would never leave Windows anyway. Why spend resources supporting Linux when customers had no choice? But now users suddenly had options. Instead of begging companies for Linux ports, many users simply ran the Windows versions directly through WinPodX. That changed the balance of power in a very unexpected way. Developers across the Linux community quickly noticed something else happening too. New users were arriving who had never used Linux before. Usually, Linux adoption spikes were temporary and driven by controversy around Windows updates or privacy concerns, but this felt different. People were actually staying. Why? Because the transition no longer felt painful. A user could install Linux, keep using their familiar Windows software, and slowly learn the Linux environment over time without losing productivity. That psychological comfort mattered more than many experts realized. One of the most fascinating aspects of WinPodX is how it quietly eliminates fear. Fear has always been Microsoft's greatest advantage. Fear of incompatibility, fear of losing files, fear of unsupported software, fear of learning something new, fear of breaking workflows. WinPodX weakens all of those fears at once. Suddenly Linux no longer feels like abandoning your old world. It feels like upgrading it. The business world started paying attention almost immediately. Small companies looking to reduce licensing costs began experimenting with Linux deployments powered by WinPodX compatibility. Schools explored whether they could finally escape expensive Windows licensing systems while still supporting required educational software. Independent creators discovered they could enjoy Linux stability while keeping access to tools they depended on for years. Some IT departments even began testing Linux workstations for employees who previously required Windows-only applications. Of course, not everyone was convinced. Critics pointed out that compatibility is never perfect. Certain highly specialized enterprise applications still experience problems. Anti-cheat systems in some multiplayer games remain difficult. DRM-heavy software occasionally breaks. Some advanced Adobe workflows still behave inconsistently depending on hardware configurations. And yes, there are still edge cases where Windows remains necessary. But what changed in 2026 is the scale. The number of applications working properly through WinPodX became large enough that millions of users suddenly realized they might not need Windows anymore. The gaming side of this story became particularly dramatic. Linux gaming was already improving rapidly, thanks to Proton and the work done by Valve Corporation with the Steam Deck, but WinPodX pushed expectations even further. Users began combining Linux performance advantages with broader Windows software compatibility, creating systems that felt incredibly flexible. Streamers showcased full gaming setups on Linux while simultaneously running Windows-only editing tools, launchers, communication apps, and modding utilities without rebooting into Windows. That kind of seamless workflow would have sounded impossible only a few years ago. Another reason WinPodX exploded in popularity is timing. The year 2026 feels very different from the computing world of 2016. Back then, Linux still looked intimidating to many users. Today, Linux desktops are visually polished, user-friendly, and surprisingly modern. Installation processes became simpler. Driver support improved massively. Hardware compatibility expanded. Gaming matured. Community documentation became easier to follow. AI tools even began helping new Linux users troubleshoot issues instantly. The ecosystem evolved quietly while most mainstream users ignored it. WinPodX arrived at exactly the right moment, when Linux was already stronger than many people realized. There's also a deeper philosophical shift happening underneath all this. For years, operating systems controlled users by controlling software ecosystems. Your applications determined your operating system. But compatibility technologies like WinPodX weaken that control. Users increasingly choose operating systems based on experience rather than necessity. And when people compare experiences honestly, Linux suddenly looks far more attractive than it did a decade ago. Many new Linux users in 2026 describe the same emotional reaction after switching: relief. Relief that their system feels faster. Relief that updates do not constantly interrupt them. Relief that their CPU usage remains lower. Relief that they are not being bombarded with ads or forced cloud integrations. Relief that their computer feels personal again instead of corporate. And now, thanks to WinPodX, they no longer sacrifice software compatibility to gain those advantages. Tech YouTubers quickly realized the impact of this shift. Videos demonstrating Windows applications running flawlessly on Linux started generating millions of views. Comment sections filled with users saying things like, "I never thought I would consider Linux before this," or "This is the first time Linux actually makes sense for me." Even long-time Windows loyalists admitted curiosity. Some installed Linux in dual boot configurations. Others tested it inside virtual machines. Many ended up staying longer than expected. The name WinPodX itself became symbolic online. For some, it represents freedom from operating system lock-in. For others, it represents the moment Linux finally became practical for mainstream computing. Memes exploded across social media showing Windows users slowly realizing they no longer had a real reason to stay trapped inside Microsoft's ecosystem. Of course, Microsoft remains enormously powerful. Windows is not disappearing tomorrow. Enterprise adoption takes years to change. But something undeniably shifted in 2026. The conversation changed. Before WinPodX, Linux discussions often sounded defensive. Linux users constantly had to explain missing software, workarounds, and compromises. Now the tone feels different. Instead of explaining limitations, users demonstrate possibilities. They show Windows apps running smoothly on Linux desktops while consuming fewer resources and offering greater privacy. That visual impact is powerful. Once people see familiar software functioning normally on Linux, mental barriers start collapsing very quickly. Another interesting consequence involves developers themselves. Some software creators began realizing they could support Linux users indirectly through WinPodX compatibility without building entirely separate Linux versions. Others saw growing Linux audiences and reconsidered official support altogether. The market pressure started changing slowly. When enough users migrate platforms, companies eventually follow. Security experts also noted benefits. Linux systems generally offer stronger permission controls and more transparent security practices compared to consumer Windows environments. Running Windows applications inside controlled Linux compatibility environments created interesting security possibilities for some users. Sandboxing features, containerization, and isolated environments became easier to manage. Advanced users began building highly customized workflows combining Linux security with Windows software access. But perhaps the most important impact of WinPodX is psychological rather than technical. For decades, Linux felt like an alternative, a niche, a hobbyist system. Something for developers, hackers, or enthusiasts. In 2026, for the first time, many ordinary users started seeing Linux as a realistic primary operating system. Not because Linux changed overnight, but because the final major barrier started disappearing. The irony is almost unbelievable. Microsoft spent years pushing users towards subscriptions, cloud dependence, AI integration, and increasingly locked-down experiences. In trying to modernize Windows aggressively, they accidentally pushed many users toward exploring alternatives. And just as that dissatisfaction reached critical levels, compatibility tools like WinPodX matured enough to make migration genuinely practical. Even content creators who previously avoided Linux started experimenting publicly. Video editors tested workflows. Music producers explored audio compatibility. Designers checked creative applications. Developers showcased coding environments. Office workers demonstrated productivity setups. The variety of use cases mattered because it proved Linux was no longer limited to programmers alone. Online communities surrounding WinPodX grew extremely fast. Forums filled with compatibility reports, optimization guides, shared configurations, and user success stories. Newcomers received help quickly. The excitement resembled the early days of major tech revolutions where people suddenly realize an old assumption may no longer be true. In this case, the assumption was simple. You need Windows to run Windows software. That statement no longer feels absolute anymore. Naturally, Microsoft supporters argued that Windows still provides the best overall compatibility and convenience. In some professional environments, that remains true. Certain enterprise ecosystems are deeply tied to Windows infrastructure. Some workflows depend on official support guarantees. Large corporations move slowly. But among individual users and smaller businesses, flexibility matters more than ever. And flexibility is exactly where Linux now shines. Some analysts even compare this moment to the smartphone revolution. Before smartphones matured, people accepted limitations because no better alternatives existed. Then suddenly, a combination of technologies aligned at the right moment, and user expectations changed forever. WinPodX may represent a similar turning point for desktop computing, not because it replaces Windows instantly, but because it changes what users believe is possible. The educational impact could also become massive over time. Schools in developing regions often struggle with expensive licensing costs and aging hardware. Linux already offered financial advantages, but software compatibility remained a challenge. If WinPodX continues improving, educational institutions may finally gain a practical path toward large-scale Linux adoption without sacrificing access to required applications. Another fascinating aspect is how quickly younger users adapt compared to older generations. Many younger users no longer feel emotionally attached to Windows specifically. They care more about flexibility, performance, customization, and privacy. If their favorite apps run on Linux smoothly, they have little reason to remain loyal to Microsoft's ecosystem. That generational shift could become increasingly important over the next decade. The environmental implications are also worth mentioning. Modern Windows versions often push users toward newer hardware requirements. Linux systems, especially lightweight distributions, can extend hardware life dramatically. Combined with WinPodX compatibility, users can continue using older computers productively, instead of replacing them prematurely. In a world increasingly concerned with electronic waste, that matters. One of the strangest outcomes of the WinPodX era is watching longtime Linux users react emotionally. Many spent years defending Linux against claims that it would never become mainstream. Some were mocked for recommending Linux. Others endured endless jokes about terminals, drivers, and incompatibility. Seeing Windows applications now running seamlessly on Linux feels almost surreal to them. For many veterans of the Linux community, 2026 feels like vindication after decades of patience. At the same time, experienced users also warn newcomers not to expect literal perfection. Linux still requires learning. Different distributions behave differently. Hardware compatibility can vary. Certain advanced workflows still benefit from native Windows environments, but the difference now is enormous. Users are no longer choosing between freedom and functionality. Increasingly, they can have both. The tech industry itself may underestimate how dangerous this moment could become for Microsoft long-term. Operating system dominance depends heavily on ecosystem dependency. Once dependency weakens, users become far more willing to experiment. And once users discover they prefer Linux experiences, winning them back becomes difficult. Already, many users who initially installed Linux just to test WinPodX ended up fully migrating within weeks. They realized their systems felt faster, cleaner, quieter, and more controllable. Some removed Windows entirely. Others kept dual boot setups only for specific edge cases. But the important thing is this: the psychological monopoly broke. There are still unanswered questions about the future. Will major software companies embrace Linux more directly? Will Microsoft respond aggressively? Could legal or technical barriers emerge later? Will anti-cheat systems and DRM continue causing problems? Nobody knows for certain. Technology evolves unpredictably. But regardless of what happens next, WinPodX already accomplished something historically important. It changed the conversation around Linux forever. Instead of asking, "Can Linux replace Windows?" people are now asking, "Why am I still using Windows?" That is an entirely different discussion, and Microsoft knows it. As 2026 continues, the silent revolution grows louder every month. More users experiment, more creators switch, more businesses test deployments. More gamers discover compatibility improvements. More students install Linux on older laptops. More people realize their computers can feel faster and freer without sacrificing the applications they rely on daily. And maybe that is the most powerful part of this entire story. WinPodX did not succeed because it forced users to abandon their habits. It succeeded because it respected them. It allowed people to carry their familiar software into a new operating system without fear. That small psychological bridge may end up reshaping desktop computing more than anyone expected. For decades, Linux enthusiasts dreamed about the year of Linux desktop. The phrase became a joke after so many false predictions. But revolutions rarely happen through one dramatic moment. Usually they happen slowly, quietly, and then all at once. In 2026, with WinPodX breaking down one of the last major barriers between Windows and Linux, it suddenly feels possible that the silent revolution has finally arrived.